Russian President Vladimir Putin's announcement of potential changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine has reignited global discussions about the nuclear threat and strategic deterrence.
It is proposed to introduce several clarifications in defining the conditions for the use of nuclear weapons. Thus, the draft of the fundamentals expands the category of states and military alliances in relation to which nuclear deterrence is carried out, adding to the list of military threats for the neutralization of which nuclear deterrence measures are carried out.
While much attention has focused on Russia, many analysts are now scrutinizing the United States Nuclear Posture Review, NPR, of 2022, which some argue carries more risks and ambiguities than Moscow's approach to nuclear arms. Russia's current doctrine emphasizes restraint and clarity, but Putin's proposed updates aim to further strengthen this position. In stark contrast, the US nuclear blueprint presents a more ambiguous and potentially hazardous stance on the use of nuclear weapons, especially when it comes to preemptive strikes and responses to non-nuclear threats.
The revised version of the document proposes to consider the aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear state proposed as their joint attack on the Russian Federation.
These hypothetical scenarios whereby association with a nuclear weapon state would be a trigger for nuclear use has been used by other countries as well. So, whereas, and I want to be clear, whereas we do not celebrate, endorse, or banalize this, how could we? We are not surprised. And this is part of the, in the calculations of countries. What we need to think about seriously is to bring diplomacy to the table and to look seriously into moving into a different phase of the conflict where the possibility of nuclear weapons use will no longer be on the table.
The US Nuclear Posture Review 2022 outlines a series of scenarios in which nuclear weapons could be deployed. Among the most contentious aspects is the rejection of a no-first-use policy. Unlike Russia, the US retains the option of launching a preemptive nuclear strike, even in the absence of a direct nuclear attack. This doctrine allows for nuclear responses to a range of high-consequence non-nuclear threats, such as large-scale cyber attacks or conventional warfare, raising concerns about the risk of nuclear escalation. Furthermore, the US doctrine leans heavily on calculated ambiguity, a deliberate strategy to keep adversaries guessing about when and how Washington might use nuclear arms. This element of uncertainty, while aimed at deterrence, could also foster miscalculations during heightened tensions. The NPR also extends the US nuclear umbrella to NATO allies and other key partners, such as Japan and South Korea, committing to their defense in case of attack. The decision to deploy nuclear weapons ultimately rests with the US president, adding a layer of unpredictability to an already volatile global environment. NATO, closely aligned with US nuclear policy, echoes much of the ambiguity embedded in Washington's doctrine. The alliance also rejects the principle of no first use and upholds the strategic nuclear forces of the US, UK, and France as the backbone of its deterrence strategy. A major attack on a NATO member could trigger a nuclear response if the fundamental security of the alliance is deemed to be at stake, further raising the stakes for global conflict. This approach, according to critics, only compounds the unpredictability surrounding the potential use of nuclear weapons in a crisis. In contrast, Russia has long committed itself to a more defined and restrained nuclear policy. Moscow adheres to a no-first-use principle, pledging not to initiate nuclear strikes unless under direct threat. Russia's doctrine explicitly outlines the conditions under which it would resort to a nuclear response, avoiding the ambiguity seen in US and NATO policies.
It's a signal warning those countries about the consequences in case of their involvement in an attack on our countries with various assets, not necessarily nuclear ones. Sober-minded heads of state, politicians, and analysts have already understood perfectly well the seriousness of President Putin's statements, especially when it comes to such things as an unprecedented confrontation provoked by the direct involvement of Western countries, including nuclear-armed countries, in the conflict around Ukraine.
While the US and NATO rely on alliances and nuclear sharing arrangements, Russia has chosen not to form any military blocs with other nuclear powers. Instead, its doctrine focuses on deterring specific adversaries, particularly those that pose direct threats to its security or those aligned with NATO. Russia's more straightforward approach to nuclear deterrence has drawn attention as the world grapples with the ongoing risks of escalation. With tensions between nuclear powers at their highest in decades, many observers argue that clarity and restraint, rather than ambiguity, should define global nuclear policy. As Washington and Moscow continue to refine their nuclear doctrines, the question remains whether the US and NATO's calculated ambiguity will prove a deterrent or lead to dangerous missteps. Putin's proposals may signal Russia's intention to further differentiate itself from Western powers in its nuclear strategy, potentially offering a path to greater stability in an increasingly uncertain world. While the West remains committed to its current strategy, the Kremlin's emphasis on transparency and defined responses could prompt renewed international dialogue on nuclear risk reduction and the future of arms control agreements. With the nuclear threat looming larger than it has in recent decades, the world watches closely to see whether US ambiguity or Russian restraint will prevail in shaping the global order.